ასეთია ქურდი კაცის ბედი პადერა კი უკანა დაზდევს მუდამ დაცხოვრების ნახევარზე მეტი ციხე გაატაროს უნდა მესაკანში მოკვდე დავიმარხო რა უყოთ რომ სასფერ ხედავმზიას აბა ხვავებს ვინ დაიჭერს კარგო კენაცვალე გალიაში ბულბულებისია აბა ხვავებს ვინ დაიჭერს კარგო კენაცვალე გალიაში ბულბულებისია ვალე დაბიდ გამზავლიან ალაბა ხოლოდ შენთან განშორება მტანჯავს ხალათისთვის არ აქცდება კარგო კენაცვალე შემგან ერთი ჟანგიანი დანა ხალათისთვის არ აქცდება კარგო კენაცვალე შემგან ერთი ჟანგიანი.
Welcome to Reimagining Soviet Georgia. My name is Brian.
And I'm Sopo.
And today on the podcast, we welcome Per Rudling from Sweden. Per, thank you for joining us today. Introduce yourself. Who are you? What do you do? And what do you research?
I'm an historian of modern Eastern Europe, primarily focusing on Western Ukraine and Western Belarus. In the interwar and post-war period, I'm working on nationalism, interethnic relations, memory, and with a particular interest in the Holocaust and its repercussions and its representation in history. So I'm an associate professor at Lund University in Sweden. Did my PhD in Canada, and my MA in the US, and worked in Singapore for a few years. And I'm the principal investigator of a project working on memory in Ukraine, and that just got prolongated. I'm working with the extension starting next year on memory or non-memories of the Holocaust or obfuscations in that regard, the non-use of the problematic past.
You wrote this really great article called Repatriating an Edifying Past: The Diaspora, Ukrainian Authoritarian Right, and Power Over Memory, 1991 to 2021. And what I really liked about this article was that you dive into the institutions, the political struggle, and the more material, institutional, and political aspects of memory, not just an analysis of the discourse. But before we dive into that, one of the most central features of your analysis of like Ukrainian far-right memory politics is the organization of Ukrainian nationalists and the Ukrainian Insurgent Army. So just for our listeners, could you explain what are these groups, who were they, and what did they do in as broad an outline as you can?
Oh, wow, that could be a very broad outline, but by and large, the organization of Ukrainian nationalists was the leading Ukrainian far-right organization, established in 1929 in Vienna, and was, of course, active in interwar Poland, but also to a lesser extent in Bukovina in Romania and in Czechoslovakia, Zakarpatska Ukraine. Ukraine was, of course, divided into 4 states during the interwar period. Then it split in 1940 into several, at least 2 wings. And there's one wing of these, the most radical one, the followers of its leader Stepan Bandera, who was leader of the Galician section of the OUN in the interwar period, which has been sort of the centerpiece for much of the Ukrainian memory politics since Bandera was affixed as a focal point of national memory under Yushchenko after the so-called Orange Revolution of 2004. And Yushchenko introduced a number of institutions, one of the most prominent one being the Ukrainian Institute of National Memory. And these were staffed with quite radically nationalistically oriented historians and politicians. And Bandera and the OUN would form during World War II an armed wing, the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, known as UPA or UPA, Ukrainska Повстанська Армія, the Ukrainian Insurgent Army. So even though Bandera and his organization, Bandera was in jail most of World War II, they declared statehood in 1941 on the 30th of June, and they collaborated with the Nazis from in the late 1930s up until 1941-42, but then took up arms against the Poles primarily, but also against the Soviets. And the UPA, the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, fought a very tenacious and vigorous resistance struggle against the Soviets that lasted up until 1946-47 as an armed phase, but also some underground groups remained active up until 1951-52. So this group is very contentious in that sense that they've been turned into heroes of a democratizing pro-NATO, pro-European state, which has sort of rehabilitated figures which are deeply authoritarian and undemocratic. Even how to describe these groups is enormously contentious in Ukraine, not so much outside Ukraine, but in the Ukrainian diaspora and in Ukraine. Even to describe them as I do and many political scientists and historians do, as a fascist group, in the sense that the symbol was a black and red Blut und Boden, blood and soil banner. They greeted each other with a raised arm salute. The prospectus for a constitution stipulated the state would be explicitly authoritarian, totalitarian. The state openly called for the extermination of Jews, Poles, and Magyars, and took part in pogroms in 1941 in particular, leading to the death of around 10,000 Jews, and then infiltrated the police and also got an intimate experience, and of course, how to use weapons and how to fight insurgencies, but also got involved in intimate political violence against Jews primarily. And then once in 1943, when the UPA was set up by a fellow by the name of Roman Shukhevich, who was one of the top figures in the UN Bandera and the acting leader of that organization during the war, they also took up arms, particularly in early 1943, against the Poles, and carried out a policy of systematic ethnic cleansing, which Poland has recognized as an act of genocide. That can, of course, also be discussed, but the idea here that the aim was ethnic cleansing, a systematic destruction of the Polish element in Western Ukraine, and the aim was the destruction of Jewry in Ukraine, and also Armenians and Czechs were also targeted by this Russian POWs and whatnot as well. That cannot be, I think, that's beyond discussion. But in Ukraine, Bandera is a national hero. He was instigated, inserted in the nationalist pantheon as a hero by Yushchenko. And laws introduced in 2015 makes it illegal to disrespect fighters or disparage the memory of Ukrainian fighters for statehood in the 20th century, and was accompanied by a long list of over 70 names that you cannot disrespect. Even though the law did not stipulate a form of penalty for this, of course, the idea was of this to police what can be said and what is permissible speech. So it's a part of an authoritarian. The paradox here: Ukraine is democratizing, turning towards the West and fighting a war for its survival, but at the same time, there has been this rather authoritarian backlashes against challenging what I call an edifying memory. A lot of the stuff that Ukrainian government is embracing is mythology. It's mythologized, airbrushed, whiteout version of the organization of Ukrainian nationalists, which does not account for its fascism, its totalitarianism, its anti-Semitism, its mass violence, but instead present them as altruistic fighters for Ukrainian freedom, and they're sort of taken out of context instead of being compared to in the context which they belong of the Ustasha and the Iron Guardists and other groups of the contemporaries. They are taken out of context and compared to Nelson Mandela and Malcolm X and Michael Collins and whatnot, and presented as progressive in a sort of like in a progressive language, taken out of this context and turned into freedom fighters. So long story short, I mean, it's a very complex issue, but hopefully we give an idea about the sort of complexities of these issues.
Has the reception by the West changed on towards this history? And did the Russian invasion trigger something, or maybe 2014 started triggering a different way to look at this because it was politically expedient? And second, if there isn't any change at all, like why do you think that is?
These changes, of course, have been radicalized and furthered by the Russian invasion, which started in 2014 and not in 2022, by the way, as that should be pointed out. But this sort of the rehabilitation of these groups started really after the Orange Revolution of 2004, and of course was exacerbated by the Russian use of gas and energy as hybrid warfare against Ukraine, and not least that from around 2004, Ukraine was started by Russian propaganda to be described as a fascist state and neo-Nazis and whatnot. That sort of rhetoric started already back then, 2004, 2005, after essentially the Orange Revolution ended, seemed to herald a path to the West out of the Russian orbit. But I think to understand this sort of revisionism, I think this needs to be studied in a regional setting because Ukraine is unique, but it isn't unique. You know, it's you see this all across the region. These groups that are driving this most tenaciously and enthusiastically are sponsored by the organization Ukrainian Nationalists abroad, but they also operate with other institutions across the post-Soviet space. The closest parallel, I think, to Ukrainian memory politics is that of Lithuania, which shares a number of similar characteristics. Both historically, they've had Poland as the significant other. They're other in their mythology, and they are also very much attached to this image of genocide. Genocide is very coveted commodity in this memory politics of memory. In Lithuania, already in 1991, they set up an institute of national memory, what they call it, the Institute for Genocide and Resistance. And the idea is, of course, that communism is a genocidal ideology, and as one of their leading figures presented there, insisted in Lithuania, is that the only difference between Hitler and Stalin is the size of the mustache. Communism and Nazism are genocidal ideologies, and Ukrainians and Lithuanians are primary genocide victims of communist genocide. And in Ukraine, even the term for the famine, the Soviet famine, the Ukrainian famine of 1932-33, is Holodomor. It starts on Holo, and it has come regularly with the number 7 million or higher. And that's, of course, a number which is not random. And the term starting on Holo is not random either. Also, that one is imported from the Ukrainian diaspora. It was articulated in the mid-1980s when there was heightened advocacy about alleged war criminals in Canada and the United States. So this idea here, once Ivan Demyanuk, or John Demyanuk from Ohio, retired auto worker, was put on trial in Israel, and he was extradited from the US, denaturalized and extradited. This, of course, stung the diaspora. And if there's a focus on Ukrainian collaborators in the Holocaust, the response is then that we focus then on our genocide, which starts on Holo and is larger. But this has to be understood in context. So the Ukrainian, in short, what this was about was that Yushchenko and his orange team was given Russia the middle index finger, and they turned their back on the Russian orbit, and they were seeking new nationalizing heroes. A problem here that appeared was that they didn't have to necessarily construct their own national mythologies. Uzbekistan had to look very far and deep to find their heroes. They found finally Timur Lenk as national hero. Moldova found the medieval prince Stepan Chalmar, but in the Ukrainian case, they had a complete literature in Ukrainian and English that could be sent back in floppy disks or be repatriated primarily from Canada, from Ontario, which had answers to all these questions, about the heroic, almost biblical struggle, the walk in the desert, the communist genocide, the heroic resistance by the UN and UPA, the self-sacrificial death of Shukhevich and Bandera at the hands of the Soviets, and then, of course, redemption in 1991 when the state became independent. So there was a rotation of memory that these were developed during the Cold War and was repatriated to Ukraine. And it's in many ways similar to the memory you have in not least in Lithuania, with a very heavy emphasis on genocide, that we are genocide victims. Communism is a politics of genocide. And often this is used competitively and instrumentally, often to deflect difficult questions about Lithuanian or Ukrainian or Latvian agency in the Holocaust. And they often call this decommunization, or it used to be called decommunization, but it has been moving on now from decommunization, what they call decolonization. And they're interlinked, and because it was easy to tear down the Lenin monuments and rename streets like, Ulica Pobedy, the Victory Street or the Soviet Street. They had to go by decree and law. But then on the local level, when a place like Kirovograd, or Kirov City in English, was renamed in 2014, following this decommunizing package, because it was illegal to have communist names on streets, then the locals wanted to then return its historical name, which was Yelisavetgrad, after Yelisaveta Petrovna, the daughter of Peter the Great, the Imperatrica. And it was harder to decommunize her. So this was expanded now to going after any form of expressions of Russian and imperial culture, and they sort of equated the Russian Federation, Soviet Union, and the Russian Federation as a legacy of hundreds of years of murder and genocide and destruction. And this is now being sort of, this decolonizing rhetoric also dressed in a progressive sounding, left-wing sounding package. Just as Mandela is put in the same basket as Bandera and Shukhevich, the current emphasis now under the Ukrainian Institute of National Memory is decolonization. And by the way, just 2 weeks ago, they presented another list of over 200 names which cannot be used in the positive terms in the public. They've decolonized now, decolonized the Decembrists, the Decabristi, the Battle of Poltava, the Battle of Borodino, the composer Modest Mussorgsky, Rimsky-Korsakov, and the Mighty Five, the Russian composers, are now being decolonized, right? And so has, of course, Lev Tolstoy and Dostoevsky and Mikhail Bulgakov and so on. So it's very interesting in that sense. It started as decommunization and it's gone into decolonization again. Progressive sounding or left-wing sounding rhetoric used for rather right-wing or nationalistic purposes. This appropriation of languages, I think is very fascinating, and again needs to be studied regionally, because this is a new trend, and now it's you see it schools of thoughts and increasingly radical calls for decolonization. Which are also, I mean, you can talk about this later on, I guess, but that's also sort of in itself not unproblematic. That I'm still always asking myself what the intended target group for this is, because Ukraine's made a choice to join NATO and the European Union, and then these decolonizing activists are sort of trying to repackage Ukraine as part of the global South, for one, the global South, South Africa and Brazil and Indonesia and India, to put it mildly, are not very interested in solidarizing themselves with Ukraine. They have done very little to help Ukraine. They have solidarized themselves with Putin and see Ukraine as a proxy of Western imperialism, and see Russia as a victim of Western imperialism. And in Ukraine, I mean, I don't know if demand is very large among the Ukrainian middle class in identify themselves with Pakistan or I don't know, Nigeria and Ghana, rather than with the post-Habsburg space of Lviv and whatnot, right? So it's that's another story, but that's also something very interesting. But I think it has to be looked at broadly, decommunization, de-Russification, decolonization. And the paradox is that Ukraine is, of course, by no means a fascist state, an authoritarian state, and whatnot. It is, in terms of democratic development, doing quite well in the post-Soviet space, even though we've seen a decline in academic freedom, scholars at risk, and academic watch groups have seen Ukraine academic freedom falling very radically in the past couple of years, a process which has been ongoing since 1999. But still, compared to Belarus, Ukraine, and for that matter, Georgia, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Ukraine is doing relatively well. But it is a paradox here that the democratizing states has this sort of like uneven development, and far-right groups become repackaged as something else. In itself, a very fascinating question.
Don't you think that a lot of this decolonization language is because the US had a moment internally where they started in academia sort of discussing decolonization and discussing the treacherous or horrible and history of the United States, which then, because it's a global hegemon, everything in the US and gets sort of packaged around the world, and also that the US had money to give grants and support to these kinds of ideas. So correct me if I'm wrong, I would look at it as the first decommunization was mostly led by the Baltics and Poland trying to join the EU. And the decommunization was one of the drives to distance themselves from communism and join the European family. And the second wave of decolonization was when US had more of an internal sort of reckoning with some academic works, and then sort of the Democratic Party took that and used it as foreign policy. Tell me if, this is my sort of theory.
I don't think you're far off. I think this whole there's an instrumental use of the way I see it of these topics, but I think also there's this problem. The larger problem I think with U.S. academia is this extreme politicization and the politicization of U.S. society, the rise of Trump and Trumpism, and for that matter Brexit and whatnot, to the polarization, the migration crisis and whatnot, led to polarization society. And then you had this with Trump's antics. You had then, Me Too and Black Lives Matter and this a left which has given up on sort of like leftist politics. What's left is identity politics. They're not really interested in doing away with capitalism. Nobody's suggesting that, right? But instead you can talk about, racialized bodies and identity politics and whatnot. And this extreme polarization that you have in the US, this intersectional analysis and whatnot, opens for this sort of for instrumentalization by various nationalist groups. I think that's the case. It's part of general politicization and radicalization, polarization of U.S. academia, which I think is tragic in so many ways. I always felt, I did my PhD in North America, and I felt in many ways many things were more dynamic than the conservative environments in Germany, not least. But now, when I follow discussions and see the programs from these various ACs and ASN and whatnot, I see it's just saturated in identity politics, and conservative places like Germany has not gone that far, and here we can sort of like, I'm interested in it as an object of inquiry, but I'm seeing these panels and seeing entire organizations being, appropriating certain language for certain political purposes is more interest to me as an object of inquiry. But I think you're right about this. That there was a momentum. And like so many things, how the Soviet famine, how the Holocaust, how now a number of issues have been decolonization has been dealt with. It's been selectively and politicized, and of course, in an increasingly politicized world, this is going to be used politically to the peril of those of us who, whatever my detractors in the Ukrainian diaspora might think, I'm not driven primarily by political concerns. I'm interested in trying to understand this process. I find this part of the world very, very interesting, very dynamic. Ukraine has this what's Huntington called the civilizational fault lines. You have here Eastern and Western Christianity. You have here the heartland of Ashkenazim Jewish culture. You have so many interesting traditions intersecting here. I find it very, very interesting. And I chose to work in Ukraine and Belarus because I have no horse in this race. I have no family there. I'm not from there. But I find it's a culture which I am really intrigued by, and I really deeply love, I have to say, both Russian and Ukrainian and Belarusian culture. I appreciate it. But then, of course, it's been so extremely politicized that it's hard to to navigate these minefields. And sometimes you get this by I mean, I will never have this sort of inside knowledge that the local will have. They grew up in Grodno in Western Belarus or in Lviv and whatnot, right? I will never know the language as well as they will. I will never have all the insights. On the other hand, I can provide perhaps a different view, an alternative view, not necessarily with fresh eyes, but with different eyes. But this has been so strongly politicized that even if you're sitting here in a quasi, not neutral position, but a more dispassionate position, looking at this, it's become increasingly difficult because this, not least due to Russia's hybrid warfare, that when before Ukraine was attacked by Russia, the casus belli was, of course, Nazis and genocide, bogus claims of that. But it was also that Putin demanded that the NATO, no new countries should join NATO, and the NATO should be rolled back to the 1997 borders. So in effect, Putin made it explicitly clear to Sweden and Finland that I'm a citizen of Sweden, that we don't have the right to have a foreign policy, right? So this war against Ukraine is also a war against our right to self-determination. So of course, in that sense, Sweden is no longer non-aligned or neutral, but we are part of NATO and whatnot. And we are also to some extent, to a very large extent, part of this trade into this hybrid war. So it's of course becoming increasingly difficult to, of course, keep a cool head and look at this dispassionately. But that's what I'm trying to do. And that's why I'm interested in these sort of movements in diaspora and in the decolonial use of history. The decommunization I find very intriguing. And the strategies of using them to deflect issues that many Ukrainian activists, for instance, are reluctant to deal with. Because if the communists were always somebody else, right? We're studying communism as a genocidal regime. Then, of course, it makes it virtually impossible to deal with your own history. You're sort of disenfranchising yourself, because the Ukraine, it's not that there weren't any Ukrainian communists, right? In fact, Ukrainians were overrepresented in the Soviet leadership. Brezhnev self-identified as Ukrainian up until 1954. Well, and if we talk about decolonization, well, he was sent to be first party secretary of Kazakhstan, right? Who are the imperialists here? Andrei Partnov, Ukrainian historian, wrote very intelligently about Dnepropetrovsk as the capital of the Soviet Sastoya, of the Soviet stagnation. They supplied a very large number of the Soviet leadership. And if we're not talking about decolonization, and I guess it's hard not to see imperial mechanisms in the Soviet Union, but if we look at that one, if you treat the Soviet Union as an empire, which I think that argument can be made, when the empire invaded Czechoslovakia in 1968, for instance, right, the head of state of the Soviet Union was Ukrainian-speaking Ukrainian, Podgorny or Pidhorny, from central Ukraine, from Poltava, right? The head of the Communist Party was Ukrainian from Dnipropetrovsk, who later on re-identified as a Russian. The foreign minister, Belarusian from Homelshchina, right? So to say here this was just the Moskali or the Muscovites running the show, I think it's very, and of course, speaking to Georgian here, Beria and Stalin, and there are some other Svanits and some other people, but not just Moskali that ran this show, but still there were sort of like in center periphery dynamics here for sure. But I think it's fair, if you come from the Ukrainian diaspora, if you're from Lviv or if you're from Lithuania, clearly you would see yourself as periphery and you can see Moscow as the imperial center. But if you are from Kharkiv or if you are from Dnipropetrovsk or Donbass, it's not self-evident that the Moskali are the imperialists and the people in Dnipropetrovsk are the subaltern colonial aboriginal Fridays, as some Ukrainian activists like to present them as. And of course, these decolonial activists, they are very eager to point out, criticize West-splainers. There's even a term for that, West-splainers, uninformed Westerners, I guess like myself, that have nasty opinions about Ukrainian patriots. But of course, these decolonizers themselves are not very, they don't hesitate to use terms like, Diki Poli, the wild fields for Eastern Ukraine, right? Colonial Fridays, the Ruski Mires and Eastern Slavic Umma, right? So like classical Orientalizing language themselves while lashing out at West-splainers. So it's in that sense too, this sort of like, identity politics, the re-ethnicization of academia, the de-universalization of academia, in this sort of climate, it becomes important what my ethnic origin is, my geographical location. And I would like, maybe I'm sort of reactionary in that way. What happened to the Enlightenment ideas? What happened to this being a college of scholars getting together and asking the question, what is true? Under at least the aim should be universalist principles, a level playing field, asking questions. For also people from Sweden and Panama and Burkina Faso and Shanghai and Indonesia should be allowed to take part in this organization, even though in this discussion, and that the quality and the value of our analysis is more worth than our, I don't know, geographical location or rank, right? If I have to be the Grand Duke of Luxembourg should not be a factor here, right? But rather the quality of your assessment. That has been sort of guiding principle since the Enlightenment. And I think I'm fearing we're losing some of this with this re-ethnicization and identity politics that are taking over parts of academia. And ironically, this is one of the reasons I got interested in this field, because I'm fascinated by nationalizing instrumentalization of history.
I always say, like, I think Georgians and Ukrainians have the least credible case against the Soviet Union, and yet they're on the front lines against it. And that's actually because they were the most entitled. That's really why, it's always like the most entitled, sort of like the, people who are like, it's generally like middle class and upper class who complain about things, and like lower class people don't, So it's very kind of telling in that sense, because they were so empowered, they continue to be trying to get to this, and European identity and so on, and trying to, use their like victimhood somehow. That's like another thing. You have to be like a victim to be accepted, and you have to say these people oppressed me. But I think it's also interesting that with Africa and Latin America, they side with Russia. It's like, like I hear people complain about this, and I'm like, well, you all disowned the Soviet Union. Like, you said this was an oppressive thing we hate, and we were a colony in it, and you left all of the history, including all the good, right? All the decolonization efforts with Russia. And now you're angry that they side with Russia. It's like, well, you did that. You spent the past 30 years denouncing it, saying I'm not part of it, that we had no agency in this. So I find this interesting, because even Zelensky was forced to sort of make a comment about World War II because Putin had that giant parade and so on. And he then had to be like, well, we also took part in defeating the Nazis too. And I feel like he was like forced into it, It's like, I was like, good. I'm glad that you actually took the step to like say that Ukraine was a huge force in World War II, But until now, really, they have been, disowning it so much, condemning it.
Well, I would say yes and no. I mean, they've been. It's a certain almost schizophrenia here. I don't want to put any diagnosis on political discourses here and biologizing them, but there is almost a schizophrenia in that regard, because on the one hand, yes, they present the Soviet Union as a foreign, illegitimate, genocidal occupation. The head of the Ukrainian Institute of National Memory, Volodymyr Vyatrovich, presented this as a 74-year-old occupation, right? That the narration, which I think from an Estonian perspective, in 1940 very clearly was very much the case. The Soviet Union came and occupied them, right? From position of Lviv, it would make sense also, but from perspective of Donbass or Kharkiv and whatnot, that was not the case. Who were the occupants here, right? So you sort of disowning this own legacy. On the other hand, they did also under Poroshenko try to appropriate parts of the Soviet legacy that they liked, right? This Institute of National Memory, on the one hand, present the Soviet rule as genocidal occupation. On the other hand, when they celebrated the commemoration of World War II, they printed big posters of this famous picture of the red banner being put on the Reichstag. And said, well, this was put on the Reichstag by a Ukrainian soldier. So then we do want to appropriate that, right? And the stuff that are nice about the Soviet Union, right? They are eager to Antonov and the airplane construction and the space projects and Gene Cheburashka. Well, that we like. But this was genocide, this was genocide, and our hollow was the biggest hollow, So if the Nazis were out to go after the Jews and kill the Jews and carry out the Holocaust, well, Soviets, the greatest defining moment in Soviet history was its extermination, the genocide of the Ukrainian nation, right? So in that sense, it is paradoxical. And as you said, right, if Austria was Hitler's first victim, right, I guess Georgia would then be Stalin's first victim. It's a very sort of convenient way of saying that, the Nazis are always somebody else, the communists are always somebody else. But then there are nice things about it that we like to keep for ourselves, and that's sort of like attempt to to have eat the cake and have it. It's been paradoxical. So and this of course leads to a need to regulate and police what can be said and how it can be said and whatnot, right? And it leads to a very unnatural and difficult conduct any form of discussion here, because if the Soviets were genocidal occupants, well, you can argue that. But what you then do with somebody like Viktor Yushchenko, who pushed this narrative, right? He was a member of the Communist Party since 1975, What was he then? Like Patang? Quisling? What was he?
He was a
What about
victim. He was a
he
hostage.
was a victim?
He was a
Well, he was
hostage.
forced to join right. He was forced to join the Communist Party, right? He had no other choice. And what about Kravchuk, who pushed this idea that the Holodomor was 10 million genocide 10 million, that communism was genocidal occupation? Well, he was not only a member of the Communist Party, he was the secretary of ideology. He was in charge of policing and going after nationalist intellectuals in the 1970s, and he made it to be second secretary of the Communist Party, right? What about him? Well, then communism was an occupation. Well, who were you then? You were what? Rudolf Höss, or you were I don't know what would be the equivalent if you want to push the hollow plus hollow line, right? What to do with Timoshenko, who was not, I don't think she was in the Communist Party, she was in the Komsomol and married to the head of the Ukrainian Komsomol. And once the country, the Soviet Union collapsed, pocketed billions of dollars in the privatization. And yet, ethnic Armenian named Timoshenko is her husband's name, colored her hair blonde, and dressed and adopted an imagery like Lesya Ukrainka, the Ukrainian poet, and speak Ukrainian with a thick Russian accent, of course. And I don't have anything against that. That reflects where she's from. But, if communism was genocide and somebody else's problem, then how do you deal with the past? And of course that goes, of course, also with the fascist legacy. Well, the UN could not be fascist. Some Ukrainian political scientists in the diaspora argue, because fascism is a way of organizing society, right? A corporatist structure in how to run, for instance, Italy or Croatia, whatnot. Since Ukrainians had no state, they could not be fascist. Since they had no state, they could not be collaborators. So Ukraine, or at least Western Ukraine, became sort of a paradoxical island here of tranquility, surrounded by a sea of fascism and a sea of collaborators, and here they had the island of non-collaboration in the middle of Europe. So there were Slovak, Croat, Hungarian, Romanian fascists, Lithuanian fascists, but not in Ukraine, right? And of course that makes, of course, also indirectly also divorces Ukraine from the European history, of which it's this self-evident part. This was a post-Habsburg area, and they shared the same architecture. They read their Zweig, they read their Stefan Zweig, they had the Prachtstraßen and the architecture. They shared this legacy, but suddenly, all other post-Habsburg states had fascism and collaboration. Well, we did not, right? In that sense, it's also very unconvincing. So there were no communists because there was an occupation. There were no fascists and no collaborators because that was not possible. So in that sense, paradoxically, this statehood, which is so fetishized, it's a fetishized commodity, becomes needed to maintain this idea of perpetual innocence and bad things done by others, mostly to others. The Holocaust, we recognize that, but this was the Holocaust, this was something done by the Germans to the Jews, whereas our group, and it's not only in Ukraine, by the way. You see this in Poland and Lithuania and whatnot too. Our group stood at the gates of the ghetto, shed a tear, and then we set the regional record in being righteous of nations. Well, I'm perhaps like rambling here now, but this idea here, this refusal to deal with local collaboration here, and this is an issue which I think is important, because collaboration was massive, not only in Ukraine but all across Europe, right? For each in Belarus, if you look at occupied Belarus, for instance, for each German policemen in Palesia or in Volhynia. There were around 20 local collaborators. And this was not, of course, just in Ukraine. This was the case across Europe. You needed to maintain a system like the Nazi occupation, like the Soviet system. It required mass involvement, coerced or willingly or whatnot. And when you have somebody like Yushchenko and what have you, Yukhnovsky, Ihor Yukhnovsky, was the first head of the Ukrainian Institute of National Memory. He joined the Communist Party in 1956, right? And then, of course, pushed the idea of genocide. So, of course, the choice of focusing on the Stalinist terror of the 1930s is understandable in that these were the worst transgressions, the worst violations, the worst crimes against its own people. The 1970s and 80s are perhaps more difficult to use instrumentally in terms of politics, but also this is something that Ukrainian, and not only Ukrainian, you have it in Georgia too, their elites did not want to talk about, because this is when these elites made their fortunes, when they built their networks, getting those IOUs, and for much of the 1990s and 2000s, these Soviet and early post-Soviet elites, these were former communists. So of course it's easy to talk about periods 90 years back in time when these people are dead, but they're still living. The communists still alive. That's only interesting when it comes to Putin, I guess. Putin and his groups, former communist KGBisti and whatnot, which they were. But you do have this closer nearby, including the Baltic states too, by the way.
An important factor in the development of the post-Soviet Ukrainian memory regime and the role of the far right is this diaspora and emigre groups. And you mentioned earlier how, like, when the Soviet Union collapses, there's basically already a nation in exile waiting, a narrative of the nation waiting to be taken. And I think that in the Georgian context, you see something very similar, but it's a slightly different topic. So can you just explain a little bit the development of the emigre and diaspora memory regime during the Cold War, both in Europe and in North America? Because obviously there were important Ukrainian far-right nationalists in Munich. You also had, of course, the people in Canada and some in the United States, right? I've even looked into the files at the Hoover Institute before of Lev Dobryansky, who was not an emigre, but of course promoted certain narratives about Soviet empire and even had an effect on how the United States would posture in the Cold War with the narrative of the captive nations or the Soviet Union being the real imperialist, or, normalizing some of the narratives that had once been the property of the anti-Bolshevik bloc of nations. So, could you just talk about, like, how was this anti-Soviet Ukrainian right-wing nationalist memory regime germinated and incubated in exile amongst the emigres and the diaspora, both institutionally and outside of institutions?
To begin with, Ukrainian diaspora is not necessarily Ukrainian diaspora as such. Even that is contentious, I guess, how I phrase this. But given that those who were Soviet citizens, there were about 3 million Ukrainians in Germany at the end of World War II that had been brought to the slave laborers and whatnot. Some were defectors, others were collaborators and whatnot. They returned following Yalta mercilessly to the Soviet Union. If you had a Soviet passport, you've been sent back to Stalin, and they were dealt with very, very harshly. Also, those who were brought there, slave laborers to Germany and whatnot. But here's the but. If you could claim that you had a Polish passport, if you had been a Polish citizen during before World War II, or a Baltic citizen, then you could reclassify as a DP, because the Western states, the Western allies, did not recognize the Molotov-Ribbentrop Treaty. So Estonian, Latvian, Lithuanian, and Polish passport holders from territories since Poland was moved towards the west, people from Halychina and from Volhynia that were in the DP camps, they could stay in the west, whereas those from the east were rather systematically, not all of them, but many were returned. So you got here a selection already there that the Ukrainian diaspora, which is presented as this post-war Ukrainian diaspora, is very, very heavily a Galician diaspora from Halychina. These were people to which the Soviet rule really was an occupation. Halych Galicia had never been under Moscow's rule before 1939, right? So when the Russians came, the Soviets came, or the Eastern Ukrainians came, this was often the first time they heard Russian, right? They'd been part of Poland in the interwar period, before that part of Austria, and all the way back to the 1349, right? So they were part of a different orbit, so to say. So with these passports, you get already a selection there. These were from Halych, the heartland of Ukrainian nationalism, and they were, a disproportionate number of them had been affiliated with the Germans, whatever term you want to call that. You know, they served, whether they'd been in Nachtigall battalion or Roland, or had been in the Waffen-SS Halych in some cases, or if they'd been in the UPA and had or administrators that had retreated with the Germans. So a very large number of them being organized and intensely political activists. The CIA, I think, no doubt exaggerates the numbers, but in their assessments in 1952, they estimated that about 90% of these emigres from Halych were supporters of Bandera. I don't think that's the case, but I think 90% of them were organized nationalists in one way or another. So they were strongly anti-Soviet, and they were very nationally conscious. And this group, they came to these DP camps in which the UN in particular asserted themselves. And already here, a collaboration with the Americans started, that they have knowledge of, they have archives, they have information about local networks of nationalists and whatnot that they shared with the Americans. And some of these people that would otherwise be illegible for immigration, such as Mykola Lebed, for instance, who was the acting leader of the UN from 1941 to 1943, who was in many ways the mastermind and the commanding, the leader of the UN at the time, up until April or May 1943, when the campaign to wipe out the Poles in Volhynia started. He came to the United States, even though he wasn't a convicted felon. He was convicted murder, in fact. So he came to the United States. And there was also this idea that for a number of years, in the early Cold War, the Banderites helped the Americans, the OSS and then the CIA, to drop agents into Western Ukraine. Very soon, the relations turned sour because the CIA was very unhappy with the UN Bandera, financing itself by smuggling drugs and alcohol and printing counterfeit US $20 bills. So the relations broke down, and they were not giving them truthful information. The British, the MI6, continued the collaboration with the Bandera movement up until 1952-53, even though the Americans asked not to do so. So there was this collaboration there for geopolitical reasons. They worked with the really authoritarian far right of Banderas, that's called, and whatnot, of the UN Bandera. But the Americans preferred to work with Lebed's group, which after 1948-49 broke with the Banderites and paid lip service to these ideas of pluralism and democracy and whatnot. And then, after the armed resistance was crushed, they went into another field of working with Tamvydav, or Tamizdat in Russian, publishing dissident literature, working with broadcast radio liberation from Bolshevism, as was originally called Radio Liberty, Radio Liberation from Bolshevism, which was a CIA operation up until 1971. And they provided a platform for a number of voices. I would say they did, in that sense, this wasn't only bad. They allowed for nationalist dissidents, religious dissidents, even dissident Marxist deviators, Ivan Zuba and whatnot, right? So the Americans sponsored that one. Paradoxically, the Americans were not interested in supporting their separatist agenda of the Ukrainian state. They supported, of course, they never recognized that the Baltics were occupied, but did not support the independence of Ukraine. So this was sort of like a marriage of convenience in which the Americans worked with these groups to use nationalism to undermine a geopolitical adversary, whereas the Lebed group, the group under Lebed, the revisionist UN, worked with the Americans, even though the Americans did not support their aim of independence. It's a sort of paradoxical situation. So that was a thing in the United States. But the real diehard, the Banderites, they found different allies. They were primarily funded by Chiang Kai-shek's Taiwan, and in Europe by Francisco Franco's Spain, and they were broadcasting from Taiwan, from Taipei, and from Madrid. because they remained committed totalitarians throughout the Cold War. Then you had this other situation. You mentioned Dobryansky and whatnot. You have, even within the immigration, you have a lot of various different groups. This Captain Nations group worked with more moderate elements, like the Melnik, the UN Melnik, the more conservative UN, whereas the Banderivtsi, UN Bandera, worked with the anti-Bolshevik bloc of nations, which was the real diehard ones, and they were different than the Captain Nations group. They overlapped sometimes, but they were generally different, because Captain Nations network got support from the U.S. government, and they did not want to support the Banderites who were anti-democratic, right? So they got funded by Shaka Franco and Salazar and whatnot, worked in that group, and they built a network of the former Axis collaborators, the Ustašists, the Ustasha, the remnants of the Iron Guardists in Romania, and in particular Ferdinand Durchansky, the former foreign minister of the Tiso regime in Slovakia. So Slovak, Romanian, Croatian, really diehard and authoritarians worked with the Bandera movement. Then there's this other situation in Canada, which adopted official multiculturalism in 1971. I can't go into detail here, but Canada, came up with this term that grew out of this problem with Quebecois separatism. The idea was to have biculturalism first, but then Ukrainian, in particular, activists launched this idea of multiculturalism. So multiculturalism became a doctrine in Canada in 1971. And today, of course, the term is very also, what is multiculturalism, right? Every society, I would say, is multicultural. As long as you're sitting here talking to somebody in Shanghai and America and in Georgia, or as long as I'm drinking coffee or eating bananas or reading the Holy Gospel, we are multicultural, right? But multiculturalism, the idea that this diversity in itself has a value, was articulated in opposition to the American idea of a melting pot, right? This was Pierre Elliott Trudeau's idea. And this one here, the Ukrainian diaspora was very, very active. And the idea here was to make this sort of a state policy. And his son, Justin Trudeau, said a few years ago that Canada is a country without a core culture. We have a mosaic of cultures, and they're all valuable. And this became funded by the taxpayers. So you got here money, Canadian taxpayers' money being distributed to Ukrainians. They were one of the major beneficiaries of this, but also the Dutch, the Druze, the Serbians, Nigerians, and whatnot, right? And in this, you got this sort of idea, this dynamics that the squeaky wheel gets the grease. So if something happens, right, the most passionately ethnicized and ethnic individuals. In the Ukrainian case, the Ukrainian Canadian Congress, which has been since the 1990s dominated by the UN Bandera, they were the, how should I put this, professional ethnic. That if you want to have the Ukrainian voice, you go out and ask the average Ukrainian Canadian. I mean, there are the Ukrainian Canadian Congress claimed to speak on behalf of 1.4 million people. But, I lived many years in Canada, and the average Ukrainian Canadian, they could care less about Bandera and Shukevich and Stetsko and whatnot, right? They're as Canadian as anybody else. They like hockey night in Canada and pickup trucks and water down beer and whatever they do, right? But there's a group of a few thousand individuals, a few tens of thousands, perhaps, individuals that are the vanguard, because this the Banderite vanguard. They literally refer to themselves as a vanguard on the Ukrainian issue. They are Leninist in that regard. They are sort of like the speaking for the nation. They're not the class conscious, but they're national conscious. And they've been benefiting from this funding from Canadian multicultural money, and they've been setting up the Saturday schools, down to even erecting monuments to individuals with quite a problematic past. And with these institutions and schools and networks and mnemonic infrastructure that they built up, they were able to reaffirm themselves as a power broker with direct connection, not only to the liberals, but also to the conservatives. They had a very, very close relation with Stephen Harper, the former prime minister, but also now, the current government in Canada. Previously, Krista Freeland, foreign minister and minister of finance, deputy prime minister, comes from this group of DP, displaced person, emigres, and was raised in these nationalist organizations, the scouting organization Plast. So they're very well connected. It's a very, very powerful group in that regard. And they developed their memory, which was anti-Soviet, and in which the Ukrainians were the victims. And of course, Ukrainians no doubt, were victims of the Soviet regime, as Russians and Uzbeks and Georgians and whatnot. But the idea here that they were also agents in this, that is not so much emphasized. But this is, of course, not Ukrainian diaspora as such. It didn't used to be. It was a Galician diaspora. And of course, the centerpiece of the memory politics, other than Bandera and the Waffen-SS Galizien and Shokhevich, was the idea of the Holodomor, which paradoxically, of course, they were in Canada because they could show Polish passports, or the parents could show Polish passports. So they had not experienced the collectivization of 1928 to 1934 themselves. They were Polish citizens, even though they claimed Poland occupied Ukraine, which is also interesting. But they were suffering Polish occupation. So the focus here on Soviet genocide has then to center then on the part of Ukraine, which they do not always think very highly of. The part of Ukraine that voted for Simonenko in the 1990s for the Ukrainian Communist Party, and then became the heartland of Yanukovych supporters. So it's also schizophrenia in that regard, right? That they are very much focusing. Eastern Ukrainians were very, very important as genocide victims, and it was important to embellish this number. I should say, I guess it goes without saying that the famine, the collectivization, was Stalin's greatest crime against his own people, against Russians, Ukrainians, Kazakhs, and whatnot, right? But all historical demographers or all serious researchers, they estimate the excess mortality in the Ukrainian SSR to 2.6 to a maximum of 3.9 million excess death as a result of the famine. This is, of course, a horrific number and horrific atrocity. Of course, one atrocity which Ukrainians partook. To take part in the collectivization, to enforce this pasportizacja, to force people into collective farms. The people are doing this on the micro level. These were, of course, locals in Ukraine as well as in Russia, in the areas most devastatedly affected by the famine, like Kazakhstan, like Eastern Central Ukraine, and the Volga region, northern Kuban and northern Caucasus. The system was. You make it very easy for yourself to say that the communists were somebody else. Ukrainians were actors in this. Tragic, depending on perspective, tragic episodes, but I guess also, even Yushik would say also, heroic episodes of defeating Nazism and whatnot, being first in space and whatnot. So it's a very mixed bag here, and it's very difficult to focus on the one hand, externalized communism, presented as a genocide, and then take those, 2.6 to 3.9 million excess death in Ukraine and SSR, and inflate that one to 7 or 10 or more, 10.5 million people. The Ukrainian Canadian Congress kept stressing that more people were killed in the famine in Ukraine, the famine genocide in Ukraine, 32-33. There were people alive in Canada at that time. And there were 10.6 million people alive in Canada in 1932-33. So they're claiming a mortality in excess of 10 million people. And when you scrutinize these claims, the inflation, this sort of manipulation of human suffering for transparent political purposes, then they get upset because, you would think that if demographers come and say the numbers are actually, it's not 10.5 million, it might be 2.6 or 3.3. Then you would think normally this is good news, right? The numbers were lower than we think but they've only chiseled those numbers, those 10 million numbers, into monuments across Canada, and it's in the textbooks. It's even in parliamentary acts. When the Parliament in Manitoba and in Ontario recognized Holodomor as genocide, they said there were 8 or 9 million people killed. So the Ukrainian Canadian provincial parliaments has already confirmed there were 9 or 10 million people killed, and you have it on the monuments. So once this has been done, and then reasons come out to say, well, it was actually a third or a quarter of that, you would think, oh, good news. This is of course, this is horrific what happened, but it was perhaps we have to revise this downwards. This could be something positive about this. No, then there's anger about this. You're trying to diminish, you call that a Holodomor denier. You are diminishing our suffering. So there's sort of like what actual research actually arrives at is less important than memory as such, right?
Yeah, this is what I wanted to ask you about. Like, it seems like the memory politics actually affect the ability for scholars who are trying to be dispassionate and objective from actually doing proper, serious research about these topics. So I want to know, like, how do the memory politics affect and limit the ability for scholars in the West, but also in Ukraine itself, from doing more objective research? And then the second part of that question is, what kind of pushback from these Ukrainian diaspora organizations or even official institutions inside of Ukraine, like the National Institute of Memory, what kind of pushback do scholars like yourself and others receive for bringing different narratives to the table?
Again, this is not just a Ukrainian phenomenon, but as part of a sort of general, unfortunate trend all across Europe and the Western world, right? They need to study in together, right? They're uh, uh, what happened now. Sweden has a political situation, a political tradition, a constitutional tradition more akin to the Americans or the British. Sweden and Finland were the only countries in the European Union which did not have laws against Holocaust denial, right? This was something that it's been a trend towards criminalizing Holocaust denial. It started in France in 1990, then Germany adopted this in 1994, and then as various illiberal regimes were established in Hungary and in Poland and whatnot, and in Poland, the number of laws were introduced how you can talk about, for instance, Jet Wagner, how you can talk about Auschwitz, using the term, as former President Obama did, Polish concentration camp. Of course, Obama knows that Auschwitz was run by the Germans, was located in occupied Germany, but in today's Poland, using that term in Poland today would make you liable to, I believe, 5 years in correction facility, because you're not allowed to say Polish concentration camps. In Poland, they've also criminalized the propagation, ironically, propagation of banderism, of Banderite ideology. It's criminal in Poland, whereas disparaging Bandera in Ukraine is criminal. So what happened here was Germany, with their particular historical legacy, has been trying to push and France too, try to push for the criminalization of Holocaust denial all across Europe. And Sweden and Finland, together with Britain, have a more liberal tradition in that regard and have resisted criminalizing this because that would violate the Swedish constitution. They have to change the constitution because freedom of speech and expression is absolute, a little bit akin to that in the United States. So, but the Germans couldn't say this. Come here, work this stuff out. Don't do this. Stop lying about the past. Allow academic freedom. Germany cannot really do that. So they elevated this to the European Union level. So in 2008, a framework decision was made asking upon all EU countries to criminalize Holocaust denial. So now Sweden has also criminalized Holocaust denial and is criminal to deny the Holocaust and some other genocides. Which those are, we don't really know, but the European Union has recognized the famine, Holodomor, as genocide. So I guess technically it would be criminal to deny the interpretation that the famine constituted deliberate genocide of the Ukrainian nation. So you have this general, tradition, general trajectory that there is revisionist politics in Poland and Hungary and Lithuania, for instance. Germany and the European Union respond by elevating these sort of like countermeasures into policing memory, affecting countries like Sweden and Finland. Britain is no longer in there, so they're not affected, but Sweden had to change the constitution to make this possible, to essentially have political prisoners of historical reasons regarding historical interpretations. So this is a general trend, and in Poland and Lithuania, they've introduced this. Poland and in Ukraine, sorry, have introduced these laws restricting what can be said, and these laws in Ukraine, this law 2538-1, the law on historical memory, explicitly was spelled out, pertains to all Ukrainian citizens, but also citizens of all countries, including stateless people, in case there might be some Palestinians or whatnot from some unrecognized states that might be making these statements. So there are ways of policing this. Of course, they can't really police you abroad. And here I'm in a relatively privileged position, being a tenured academic at the Swedish institution. But the way this can be dealt with is by having this. The Ukrainian Institute of National Memory had these panel discussions. They're outlining peoples that they present as parroting Moscow's line, singling out a number of historians, I being one of them. For if you're focusing, for instance, on Shukhevich, the leader of the UPA, and his involvement in collaboration with the Nazis, and his as commander of the Nachtigall, taking part in mass shooting of Jews, and as commander of UPA in massacres of Poles. If I'm focusing on this, this by default is being seen as parroting Moscow's line, because Moscow didn't like Shukhevich either. Ergo, you must be running Putin's errands. But more than that, what I think is interesting is that they're using social control regarding this. That the sponsors of the Ukrainian Institute of National Memory, which is staffed by this group, the Bandera-led Center for Study of the Liberation Movement, they are operating from Ontario, from Toronto, with government supported by, underwritten by Canadian taxpayers. And they have systematically on a yearly basis since 2011, I believe, most years there've been letters to my universities where I've been working, alleging that, well, often in the form of like, we would like to have a dialogue, dear Dean so and so, or dear Vice Chancellor so and so, or even dear Minister of Education. It has come to our attention that somebody, Sweden cannot lend itself to be a platform for Russian propaganda. Sweden is a victim of hybrid warfare from Russia, yada, yada, yada. And here's a copy of the Swedish National Intelligence yearbook. And we are greatly concerned that the scholar at your esteemed university, Mr. X, is spreading and amplifying Moscow's propaganda. We would like to have a dialogue with you about this, how this can be addressed. And of course, it's very interesting that in Sweden, we have all the correspondence going to the Swedish universities. Since I'm a government employee and this is a government institution, all the correspondence to the university is, of course, public access. So of course, these discussions about what sort of character I am and strong allegations, insinuations that I'm working involved in high treason, working for foreign intelligence in hostile states, I get to see this, right? But it's very interesting because they've done this systematically. They've done this to other scholars at the University of Toronto, the University of Alberta. They didn't always get to see them. So here we have the transparency in Sweden that these sort of letters to the university are being public. So this idea of policing the discourse of certain views that they don't want to hear are now, of course, easier to attack as supposedly working for a hostile state. But again, I mean, this is, or there are also, formal reports of academic allegations of academic misconduct. I had one this early this year, accusing me of illicit academic practices. It goes to this board here, and it goes to my dean. And of course, I have to explain, what this is. And the person who reported me here, he's raised in the Bandera wing of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, and this is sort of like something that many historians in Canada and elsewhere are faced with. But of course, this is a nuisance. It sucks up my time and other scholars' time. But in that sense, I'm also privileged that had I been at the Ukrainian institution and let like that would have come to my dean in Lviv or Kiev, well, I don't think I would dare to write what I'm writing here. I couldn't do that in Poland or Ukraine or Lithuania or Hungary, right? I'm knock on wood. I'm still in a liberal democracy where we have a pretty high level of freedom of speech in Sweden. So I'm in a privileged situation that, I can actually stand my ground on this one. And this is what I'm doing research on. And what I can do is just, speak for this, and then as a rule, then I get emails from Ukrainian scholars say like, I'm so glad you're doing this because I couldn't do it here, or Polish colleagues, or Hungarian colleagues. So I'm no martyr or anything like that. Far from it, right? I'm pretty privileged here. But you know what? How do you deal with this? I mean, in and of itself, it's a flip side of identity politics. If you do, the decolonial, identity politics on the left on one side, this is the decolonial identity politics on the far right. And both are, to me, very, very interesting phenomena that I think do great harm to our understanding of the past. They are debasing academia, but they're also subjects which are fascinating in their own right. And I'm one of the few people as a tenured academic with pretty generous funding to have this platform to do the work I appreciate and I think is important. And some people also appreciate, but of course this is contentious, particularly now as Russia's conducting this war. And of course, some people might come across as, yeah, well, Putin says Ukrainians are Nazis, so why are you focusing on Ukrainian collaboration in the Holocaust or Lithuanian collaboration in the Holocaust? The patriotic thing, the decent thing would be to talk about Holodomor now and to talk about something else, right? On the other hand, it has always been a good time to talk about something else. It was not time during the Cold War to talk about this because Ukraine was occupied. It was not a good time to talk about this during the Orange Revolution because now the Ukrainian people are standing up. And now Ukraine is under attack. So it's never a good time to talk about this. But there's always time for an Holodomor commemoration. There's always time for a new monument to Shukhevich, right? That's not problematized. Or except when there's a short circuit and there's a standing ovation or two standing ovations to a Waffen-SS veteran in the Canadian Parliament, and the questions being raised. Well, how did this come to pass? Why did the Canadian Parliament bring a Waffen-SS veteran to Parliament? Why did they give him a standing round of applause? Why wasn't this dealt with? Why wasn't these people screened? Why haven't we dealt with this? Why are the archives on the Holocaust pertaining to these alleged war criminals still closed and inaccessible in Canada 80 years plus after the Holocaust, right? So these are issues that should be and should be discussed, and I hope to do my little piece on contributing to this, but I don't see my role as political here. This is the result of many years of research in the archives, and have a wealth, tens of thousands of documents here from the archives that I feel is frustration that we see here now. When I present this to the German historians, to Israeli historians, the story that Ukrainian nationalists were involved in the Holocaust, that, well, Jan, we knew that. What else is new? But you see here this growing wedge, this gulf, this cleft between the documents that I have in the thousands of my computer and what I know as a scholar, what actually the historical record says, and what these institutes of national memory, be them Polish, Lithuanian, Ukrainian, or Russian, or Belarusian, would like us to believe, right? That wedge, this cleft is growing. And now is the time to deal with this. Of course, now when Russia says Ukraine are Nazis, well, of course they're not Nazis, but there is at the heart of this an undigested past that should have been dealt with in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and it was missed. The Canadian authorities messed up on this one in the 1980s with the Deschênes Commission. They covered this up, but they didn't properly address these issues. And this allowed these activists to continue for another 40 years. And re-export this to Ukraine. And now I guess I fear the train has left the platform. So I'm speaking to other scholars, and I'm not going to try to convince. I mean, some of this stuff is technically illegal in Ukraine and Poland. And Canadian politicians and Ukrainian politicians have already decided that there were 10 million people dead in the Holodomor, that Bandera is a hero. And this is now, so it's very hard to get sort of toothpaste back in the tube, right? It's out there and it's taken on a life of its own. But what I can do is, of course, to keep publishing and provide an alternative to the official legislated laws, what the Canadian and the Ukrainian government says has happened and transpired. And here I can give an alternative. But I don't know how much. Historians think they're very important people, right? We think we are really important. I don't think we are as important. We speak to a small group of other colleagues, and what other people do with these facts, and what we generate, the chronicles and whatnot, that we can't really control. But at least now, it's going to be harder to claim again, as Yushchenko and the Canadian government that did. There are 10 million plus dead in the famine. That it's going to be hard to say, uncritically say, well, the Waffen-SS Galician, the 14th Waffen-SS, they are heroes. They're Canadian heroes, the Ukrainian heroes. That is becoming increasingly difficult. And that is because, fortunately, again, knock on wood, some of us doing critical research. And by the way, many of which Ukrainian scholars, very up-and-coming, promising, and very brave Ukrainian and Polish and Hungarian scholars, they should not be forgotten. They are doing taking a punch. They're much more exposed than any of us sitting here in the Northern European cozy armchair, right? So that should be recognized too. So, and they are often the unsung heroes in this. But they, of course, have to adjust what they say as the thumbscrews are being tightened, and academic freedom is declining across the region.
The way that not only are these institutions in these countries, but how the discourse and ability to have these discussions in the West amongst academics, like you mentioned, some of these conferences that happen. I mean, it's just amazing how captured they are by very specific narratives about the Soviet past, about interwar nationalisms. And in fact, these kind of pressure on the popular memory politics push these scholars to begin reconceptualizing their own theories to rehabilitate some of these ideas that had never been digested before. And so it's kind of this like feedback loop, and it's a very disturbing trend to watch. And of course, I was going to say too, from the perspective of Georgia, there's been a long problem where, there's been German NGOs that have affiliations with certain political parties inside of Germany, and they put on conferences or fund academic work to reproduce certain narratives about the past at the expense of others, and especially about engaging with Georgia's Soviet past. There's a kind of production and support for crude kind of anti-Soviet memory politics, and a crude anti-Soviet memory regime at the expense of more nuanced discussions about Georgia's Soviet past, about the role of Georgians, about the complexities of the Soviet nation building project. And I think it's really important. This is one of the reasons why I was so excited to have you on, because of the way that the discussions of memory and the reproduction of memory regimes have an institutional and material basis. Like, they're not just people sitting around a table talking about some ideas. They have people, they have politics, they have money, they have states. There's like a real material thing to the reproduction of these memory regimes, and so it's really important to be, when we discuss history critically, to also think about how some of these narratives are not just cultural questions of identity, but actually have a material basis to them.
Yeah, that sort of history, unfortunately, there's been less of that, right? In this sort of like field of memory studies is often a discussion. Well, some people, you can read some articles on Bandera almost ended up in the conclusion saying like, well, some people think this man was a great hero, other people disagree, right? And then sort of like, what's the problem here, right? And I say, and they have diaspora activists say like, if some people want to glorify this Bandera, let them. Who are you to teach them? You're colonial, you're imperialists, ultimately you're aiding a genocide, Putin's genocide of Ukrainians. But the same people that are very angry, they said, you should not focus on Bandera, they just make this sort of like, relativize this. Some people like him, some people do not. Who are you to speak? They are very upset when there's a Stalin monument coming up in Moscow, in the Moscow subway, then they're the first to say, how dare they doing this, right? The same people that have no problem with Bandera, they get up in arms about the Stalin statue. And so I'm not saying that that they're right here or wrong there. So I just ask for some sort of consistency here. I think consistency here is something to be asked for. If you have a problem with Bandera monuments, well, then you should have a problem with Stalin, and vice versa. And the remedy to this is just deal with history, address these issues. The more the merrier, not less, not more laws. And I think that's the paradox here, as alluded to, I think. That these people that I'm sometimes interested in, and you seem to be too, this sort of like the infrastructure, both Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, the CA operations. You have also these emigre groups, Captain Nations, Anti-Bolshevik Bloc of Nations. And for that matter, academic institutions like the Association for the Studies of Nationalities, which is a very good, excellent organization today, and the flagship journal Nationalists papers, well, that was set up by the organization Ukrainian Nationalists, Bandera Wing. And that is sort of like, had not been problematized. And I'm the first one, as far as I can see, who brings this one up. And when I sent this out to peer review, I got very aggressive, but very angry rebuttals. How do you know that? You better back this one up, because this can be libelous saying this. So well, I wouldn't just make stuff up. By the way, the guy who set this one up was also in the Waffen SS. And so, we haven't heard about that. How come we haven't heard about this? Was literally the response you get in the reviews. How come we haven't heard about this? Well, maybe because you haven't done the research. And now you can go, thanks to the Nazi War Crimes Act and the Japanese Imperial War Crimes Act, in 2005, 2007, the CIA was forced, kicking and screaming, to release a treasure trove of documents. And the funny thing is, like, when you're working on this, these people who made careers of Kremlology, they made careers of studying the Soviet Union, studying the Soviet regime, studying Putin's regime. And I don't disparage that. I think that's important. But once the same sort of scrutiny is placed on these networks, on the Kremlologists themselves, who fund them, which emigrant groups are they from, which emigrant parties, what are the networks, how come this hasn't been, then it's disbelief or anger or literally, how come you say this? How come I never heard that the founder of the Association of Studies Nationalities was an officer in the Waffen SS? Well, yeah, there are reasons for that, right? So the same thing, that there are many things about the Chinese regime or the Soviet regime we didn't know until archives opened. Now the archives are open. And I think here, the more the merrier, get them out there. But instead, you see here laws. But I think I'm still happy in that sense that to work in a place like Sweden, and not only Sweden, but a number of societies that are, I think, rather transparent and open about the past. They don't really have these laws, and they don't have national heroes, because often you get this response: well, if we don't have Bandera, if we don't have the UPA, and if we don't have the Waffen-SS Galician, what heroes can we then have? We need to have heroes because the Russians have heroes. We need to have our heroes. And to that is like my rejoinder is, well, many successful societies do not have heroes. If people ask me, mention a Swedish hero, I wouldn't be able to come up with one. Mention a Dutch hero or a New Zealand hero, come up with a big Canadian hero. Well, you get maybe Wayne Gretzky or Terry Fox, I don't know, what have you, ABBA or whatnot, something mindless like this, right? But it's the whole idea that you need to have a Bismarck or Napoleon or a Bandera or some Stalin to kick some ass, right? That idea is sort of very much dated. It used to be the way my grandma grew up, that Charles XII or Gustav Adolf, who sacrificed his blood for the purity of the evangelical Lutheran faith in Breitenfels and Lützen. That stuff died away 100 years ago. So here, in that sense, it's a challenge, because Sweden is, in that sense, like Canada in many ways, post-historical. In Poland and Ukraine are intensely focused on history, right? One Ukrainian historian said very intelligently that history and memory is like alcohol. It's a lubricant. In small doses, it can be good as a social lubricant. But the problem here in our part of Europe is we're having too much of this, and we'll be getting infested by this, saturated with this sort of memory. So in Sweden, in that sense, it's opposite, right? Like in Canada, people say, they literally cannot understand what people when my dean get angry letters claim here from some sort of like Ukrainian Liberation Front in Ontario claim that you have a Russian agent among you, and that statistics about how many times I've dishonored the great leader Bandera or Shukevich. They literally sort of like a short circuit, who are those people? Why do they sit in Toronto? And why don't they go back to Ukraine? There's a war there. Why are they so angry with you? What have you said? And they look at the articles I've written and say, well, this went through peer review, right? Yes. Well, so what's the problem? You presented at international conferences. Yes. So what's the problem? Well, they think I'm doing this on behalf of a foreign government. So, well, why didn't they then write the rejoinder? Why didn't they write you? Why do they write to us? What should I do here? Even if I would like to censor you and send you to some sort of place far away, we couldn't do it, right? So it's very strange in that regard. So Sweden is post-historical, and so it's a good place to sit in, and maybe also somebody's interest in history, that we can show that this history has a political relevance, not only so much about Bandera or Shukevich, but because this is directly linked to aims at policing history and to our academic and political and social freedoms. That is something I didn't really think about when I started this field, but over the past 20 years, we've gone in this direction, that this really becomes about civil liberties, and freedom of speech, ultimately. Paradoxically projected back on times on people that were enemies of freedom of speech, paradoxically, both Brezhnev and Bandera, and both Putin's heroes and Yushchenko's heroes were less than democratic, right?
I mean, what's fascinating is that, we have Stalin in Georgia, but we're not allowed to have that as our hero, though. So like everybody else, like trying to find some big man, but in Stalin, like that's considered like horrible, right? Like they're one of the activisms is like protesters come and spray paint like any communist symbol or any Stalin, So it's like who you're allowed to have. I mean, we are like Georgia, we are so lucky compared to Eastern Europe, honestly, because our pre-Soviet history was by social democrats. So it was like our, nation building was like still leftist, like still like pretty decent. Like we don't have Nazis and fascists. Like their entire nation building is like Nazis, like so we're very privileged. But interestingly enough, they hate socialists so much that they still will not like make the First Republic a real, like, they never really talk about it, besides that it was somehow this moment in time for 3 years, there was an independent nation, very much devoid of content because they hate socialism and communism and they don't want to acknowledge it, right? So, they sometimes they'll try to find some other people, throughout history to somehow, and it's like they go back like 1,000 years ago, to like Tamar the Great or something, because they have nowhere else. They hate the socialists, they hate the communists, We don't have enough Nazis. So it's like it's a very funny process watching it.
Actually, in Ukraine, they have a number of heroes that I think if you have to have national heroes, if you think that's a prerogative and you need to have heroes to be a state, I don't agree with those premises. But if that's the case, there were a number of people that quite decent people. There were socialists, the left wing, and liberals in around 1918, 1915. You have Vinochenko, you have Doroshenko. There was a number of figures that were. But the problem with the democratic socialists or not democratic socialists back then was that the bulk of them, many of them were in various forms federalists. They want to have a democratic or socialist Ukraine in federation with Russia one way or another. There were very few people that wanted an outright independent Ukraine, so that's why they're not touching the socialist federalists from 1918, right, of the Ukrainian People's Republic. Even though there's been
The same thing with Georgia, but the only thing is they accidentally got independence. So
yeah, the Mensheviks were
but they were also not trying to find, separate. They were just like, oops, like Moscow fell, so we're now independent, like accidentally.
Then you had people who tried to bring back the memory of the Mensheviks and the First Republic, but then use that as an instrument to suppress discussions about the Soviet past. So it's like a memory civil war happening by various sides because, like, the government of both the previous government of Saakashvili and then the current one, they don't want to talk about the social democracy or the socialism of the Menshevik government from 1918 to 1921. But then this kind of NGO, intelligentsia, liberal, social, maybe even social democratically pro-European inclined class, which is, of course, a privileged class inside of the country with connections to Western academia, kind of over fetishize this period, but then for the purpose of proving some kind of eternal pro-European orientation, right, at the expense of the 70-year Soviet experience, right, by maybe sometimes overemphasizing the democratic credentials of the Menshevik period or saying that it was much longer than it was or whatever the case may be. So you see that this kind of like permanent history civil war is never ending.
Rauchot rom sheglitzi ras horebam, genazol თბილისის ყველა ქუჩა ვიცი